life and death. And there can be and it makes it harder for the other side to accept democratic outcomes which aren't in their favor. And we saw this at some level in 2016 when Trump won. I think many of us felt that our country was under threat in this very foundational way. Luckily, we got through it and we survived. And we saw an intensification of that in 2020 when many Republicans, unfortunately, were not willing to accept the results when Joe Biden won. The question is, can we keep on doing this every 4 years where each party sees the other as, in some sense, illegitimate? So we have to find a way to lower the stakes and to also acknowledge that life is elsewhere. Politics isn't everything, and that there have to be other pursuits and other things that we value above politics, and that can help us have some degree of modesty and humility about politics in this world, that there are no final victories. And I think one thing that religion at its best offers is a kind of postponement of judgment, that final judgments don't have to happen here and now, because that is obviously very intense, but can actually come, in the next life, if you believe in that. And if you don't believe in the next life, then presumably this wouldn't come at all. And you could still find a way to postpone this and say that not everything has to be focused on this particular moment, because we are fallible. We don't always know what's right in the moment, and to be able to acknowledge being wrong about big political questions is something I think both parties have to become better at doing. But I don't know if we're moving in that direction. I think we're moving in the opposite direction.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. This is On Point. Shadi Hamid, hang on here for just a second, because I want to bring Joseph Bottom into the conversation. He joins us from Black Hills, South Dakota. He's a professor of philosophy and director of the Classics Institute at Dakota State University, author of many books, including An Anxious Age, The Post-Protestant Ethic, and the Spirit of America. Joseph Bottom, welcome to you.
Thanks for having me.
How are you seeing a rise in religiosity in American politics? Where are you seeing it?
Well, of course, it's everywhere. It's on the left, it's on the right. It's been going on for many years. I'm a little troubled by religiosity in this context, that word, as a kind of generic word, because it seems to me taking the kind of step back that Shadi Hamid advises us to do is exactly right, but it needs to be a step back in American history. We need to look at the shape of this kind of thing. When you played those clips from Kelsey Obeywe, they were extraordinary. And, you correctly identified the very churchy kind of non-church going that he's practicing and that he's going to politics for. But I think we also want to say it's a very American kind of non-church going. And in particular, it takes its cues of behavior and attitude and moral outrage and sense of self from the defining kind of American religiosity, which was Protestantism.
Okay.
This is not generic Christian belief. This is not how Catholics in Italy fall away from the church. This is how Americans, as heirs of the social gospel movement, as heirs of these clashing mainline churches. Mainline is a word from the 1950s, but we can kind of import it back to think of these sort of mainstream of American Protestantism, magisterial churches, and they gave a shape to the country. This was the Mississippi that rolled through American history.
Well, Joseph Bottom, stand by for just a second, because we're 20 seconds off from a break. I want to hear much more about this when we come back. This is On Point.
Yeah, it's live.
Farmers in drought-ridden California have been pumping water from wells to grow fruits, vegetables, and nuts. But that's unsustainable, especially with climate change.
So I find that we've all taken for granted
It's not infinite, and I think that's what's coming home to all of it.
Now the state is putting limits on groundwater pumping. More this afternoon on All Things Considered from NPR News.
The distinguished Jeremy Webb, author of Pluses and Minuses, comrade, fellow targeted individual.
And you can catch up on what happened while you were going about your day during All Things Considered, including VPR News every half hour. That's weekday afternoons between 4 and 6:30. Coming up today on 1A, record heat in the west, record cold in the south, and catastrophic flooding in between. Lives are being lost and habitats transformed as the climate emergency escalates. 1A examines what we're doing about it and if we're doing enough. Stay with us for 1A. That starts at 11. VPR has support from our sustaining members and Champlain area trails, saving land, making trails in New York's Champlain Valley. Trail maps available at ChamplainAreaTrails.com. And Daniels Moving and Storage, working to provide a stress-free experience for local and long-distance moves. Services at MoveDaniels.com.
Support for On Point comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston, from Mathworks, creators of MATLAB and Simulink software for technical computing and model-based design. Mathworks, accelerating the pace of discovery in engineering and science. Learn more at mathworks.com. And Angie. Angie's List is now Angie, committed to helping homeowners find the right pros for home improvement projects. Homeowners can read reviews, see upfront pricing for hundreds of projects, and book appointments at Angie.com.
Thought we were going to get a little rain last night.
This is On Point. I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. We are talking about some of the challenges facing the country, and as always, we are also looking for solutions to those challenges, trying to shine a light on the way ahead. So we want to know, what are you witnessing in the city or town you live in? What are your family and friends sharing with you? Tell us your story or leave us your questions at 617-353-0683. That's 617-353-0683. You can also reach us via Twitter or Facebook at On Point Radio, and you can always continue the conversation and get the On Point podcast at our website, onpointradio.org. Today, we are talking about the fact that the Gallup organization has found that now, for the first time, fewer than half of Americans say they belong to a house of worship. And we're wondering where that need for community, for moral grounding, has gone, and if it's gone in part into or further into American politics. I'm joined today by Shadi Hamid. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer for The Atlantic. Recently wrote an article about this for The Atlantic. Joseph Bottom joins us as well. He's a professor of philosophy at Dakota State University and author of An Anxious Age. And Professor Bottom, before the break, I'm sorry I had to interrupt you there, but you were talking about a particular American kind of church going and why understanding that's important to this conversation. Continue, please.
Tocqueville speaks of the rival denominations and how they disagreed with one another. The Lutherans disagreed with the Methodists, and the Methodists disagreed with the Congregationalists. But these were all Protestant sects, Protestant denominations, and he says they combined, despite their theological disagreements, they combined to provide what he called the central current of American morals and manners. And this central current lasted for a long time. In 1965, just over 50% of Americans belonged to one of 7 Protestant denominations. And this is what we meant by the main line. These are the churches you see as you drive down the leafy streets of small city America. It's the Methodist Church and the United Church of Christ and the Disciples of Christ and the Episcopalians. And this was very American. When the National Council of Churches, which united them, built its office building in New York, the God Box up on Riverside Drive, President Eisenhower flew up to lay the cornerstone of the building because this was America. This was the central theme of America, American experience, a very American institution. Today, the numbers who belong to those 7 denominations is under 10%. That is a huge sociological shift. And what the collapse of the churches did is produce the strange 1990s, for instance, that Shadi and Casper spoke of.
Right.
Because with the dropping out of the mainline churches that gave this blue blood American tone to our institutions, the two largest Christian groups that had always been on the outside, the evangelicals on one side and the Catholics on the other, were sort of sucked into the vacuum and met for the first time. Most evangelical Bible church members had never even met a Catholic, and suddenly they were on the same side. Eventually, they came to be on the same side on the abortion debate, for instance. And this made American politics very strange. But one way to perceive it is everyone is struggling to position themselves as the new mainline. We saw this in the 80s with feminism. We saw this in the 1990s with the neoconservatives. We're seeing it now with both sides, but especially the Antifa Black Lives Matter left that wants to say that they are the moral center of the nation. They give the tone to everything else. The way I put it, which is echoed by both your other guests, is when you think your ordinary political opponents are not merely mistaken, but actually evil, you have ceased to do politics and begun to do religion.
Yeah. Well, I would argue that exact belief is also evident on the right in terms of, again, I keep coming back to the fervor with which people threw themselves behind or at the feet, if I can use that metaphor, of Donald Trump. I mean, the language of evil was very much used on the right as well. And what I'm curious to know, Joseph Bottom, I come back to a question that I asked to Shadi Hamid a few minutes ago, and I'd love to hear your answer to it. And that is, if for the sake of argument, we could say, presume for a moment that before the collapse of the Protestant mainline churches, as you were saying, in terms of membership, that was a place for people's belief, value, moral groundings to have a home. But if that home is now seen as American politics, to me, the big difference is that politics and then its enacting vehicle of policy has an impact way beyond people who have those same beliefs, right? It's actually a way to have an impact on everyone in this country, regardless of their beliefs. And that's troubling to me.
Magna, there you put your finger on exactly the danger. When the churches contained demons, they corralled them and barricaded them off. Your anxieties about salvation, and I do want to talk about that because I think spiritual anxiety is an underutilized sociological tool that Max Weber gave us, and we need to resurrect it to look at America today and to understand it. But you put your finger exactly on the problem. When you have fundamental disagreements in church, you can exclude, you can banish, you can shun, you can try for heresy, you can do all kinds of things that churches have had thousands of years of experience putting together their response to. But when those ideas escape the churches and they enter politics and they enter our workplace, suddenly you don't have the distinction between the religious space and the secular space. So how can you work with someone who thinks Trump was a great guy? It may seem ridiculous that you would think that, but how can you work with someone like that? Because that person is evil. And in the church, that question made sense. How can you worship with someone who actually is a secret follower of Satan? There's an obvious and easy answer to that. But the workplace was supposed to be secular. It's where we could keep our religious ideas out of it because we had a place to put them in our churches. Now they've escaped. And what do you do in your, as Casper mentioned, your exercise group? There was a wonderful little knitting group on Instagram a couple of years ago that blew up over political questions. And we tend to find this pressure on both the left and right, as you said, to politicize everything. And the pressure comes from the religious fervor of those political ideas.
Well, let Shadi Hamid bring him back in here into the conversation. Shadi, your response to what Joseph Bottom's saying.
Yeah, I think that, so the question is why, it's a question about human nature, that do we naturally incline towards having religious fervor, and that it has to be, if it's not directed in one place, it will be transferred to another. And I think that there was this sense through the latter half of the 20th century that we could move beyond those fervors and enjoy life, focus on leisure, just look inwards. And I think that there was a fundamental mistaken assumption there that some of these passions that I would argue are inherent to the human condition can in fact be displaced. And I think what we're seeing is their reemergence in any number of ways. I mean, that is still somewhat contested, but I think we're seeing more and more evidence of this. And it's not just in the U.S. context, but also with the rise of far-right Hindu nationalists in India, the religious right in Israel, Bolsonaro in Brazil, the list goes on. So, and I would say, too, that Americans have been a nation of believers, and I mean that in a broader sense, that we do have a history of fervor really from the beginning.
Yes.
That, where maybe you could say in certain Western European countries, again, you can sort of fall back on a common sense of ethnicity. These are still relatively homogenous countries, at least compared to the racial diversity that we see in the U.S., but we can't fall back, and it's good that we can't fall back on a shared ethnicity. That wouldn't be a good option, and I think that there are many on the right who are trying to do that, and that's dangerous. And so in that sense, it's a uniquely American predicament of what to do with all this excess fervor and belief and passion.
Well, so I want to offer this thought. I was talking about today's show with our news analyst, the ever brilliant Jack Beatty, yesterday, and he pointed me to Richard Hofstadter in The Paranoid Style of American Politics. I know both of you know it really well. And Jack pointed me to this particular quote, where Hofstadter writes, "Political life is not simply the arena in which conflicting interests of various social groups in concrete material gains are fought out. It is also an arena in which status aspirations and frustrations are projected." And Jack suggested that we've always had this mix of interest-based politics, material aims and goals, to put it simply, and status-based politics. But now we're very strongly tipping over into status-based politics, or identity-based politics being the predominant animating force here. And he pointed out that here's one measurable way in which that's having an impact on the entire country. There was a recent poll of Republican voters, and they were asked, what should the goals of government be? And only 25% of the respondents said it should be enacting good public policies. 50% of them said the goal of government should be ensuring the country's, quote, survival as we know it. Now, Joseph Bottom, I don't know how that approach is tenable or sustainable in what's supposed to be a secular democracy.
Well, we would have to drill down in that data a little bit, because those people concerned about foreign policy could well answer that question that way without being prone to this kind of religiosity we're describing. So I'd want to get a little more information before I took that poll at face value. But I know what you mean, right? Our politics is rife with all this religious anxiety. And like all anxieties in the social context, it matches up with social anxieties and questions of class. The thing about those blue-blooded Protestants who set the tone for America, at least through the 1950s, is they were overtaken by enthusiastic